Hey you guys, welcome back to my channel, and today we're doing another commentary with Clyve production. This time focusing on the roster of Mortal Kombat X. If you're new to this channel, in December of last year I started a 3-part series where I discussed the roster of the last few Mortal Kombat games, and I started with Mortal Kombat 9. If you haven't watched that video yet, I've put the link down in the description below. Please check it out. Well, today we're doing part 2, where I'm talking about MKX, and just like with the last video, we're going to split this video into different sections. First, we're going to talk about the background, and that's a very high level discussion about what's going on with the franchise as well as the development studio. Then we're going to talk about the roster, literally go through and talk about each character that was put on this roster. And then we're going to discuss the pros and the cons, and that's where I really just give my general opinion of the roster, the expectations, the themes, and even a rating. So before we get started, thank you so much for watching this video. Please give it a like, please share. The links to the rest of my social media accounts are down in the description below. Check out my Twitch, Twitter, as well as Instagram. And without further ado, let's get started. Before we start exploring the roster that MKX gave us, I just want to highlight some things about the state of the Mortal Kombat franchise prior to it being released on April 17, 2015. So first, NRS at this time, they have firmly established themselves as a studio that produced 2 AAA fighting games. The first being Mk9, which was released in April of 2011, and that game went on to sell 5 million copies worldwide, and it's probably still selling more. And that's thanks in part to the legacy characters that built the rich lore that is Mortal Kombat. All of them from MK1 to 3 were playable on that roster. But in addition to Mk9, this studio also put out Injustice: God Among Us, which was released in April of 2013. And this game is basically a DC-based fighting game that included some of DC's most recognizable characters like Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, Joker, and even some not as popular ones such as Raven, Ares, and Killer Frost. Well, this game went on to sell 424,000 copies in April of 2013 alone. And that was the only game to sell over 250,000 copies in April of 2013. Secondly, Mk9 Story Mode was revolutionary in setting the tone for what a story mode inside of a fighting game really should be. It was very cinematic, it had chapters, you got to play as different characters. Mk9 really revolutionized this mode because traditionally story modes in fighting games have not been good. And Injustice followed this same formula. The story mode for Injustice was just as good. In fact, it was much better than Mk9. You could see that they were improving as they went on with the game. So by default, this set the expectation for MKX's story mode. And the reason why I mention the story mode is because the story is largely shaped by those characters who are playable on the roster. And finally, while Mk9's roster successfully reestablished the presence of Mortal Kombat's most classic and beloved characters, the story mode killed off many of those characters. If you recall the infamous Sindel sequence where she kind of runs through and just kills a ton of the Mortal Kombat characters, the effect of this is the fates of those characters were largely unknown because they were killed. And that becomes central to talking about the characters that were available to us and playable on the roster of MKX. So let's jump into that right now. So the cast. MKX launched with 24 playable characters and 1 pre-order bonus DLC character, which was Goro. This was cool because historically Goro has been a sub-boss character and he isn't always playable. I mean, sometimes he might be, but for the most part we know him and remember him as a character that is not really playable. Well, at the launch of MKX you were able to play as him, and I thought that was cool. Alongside Goro, a handful of other characters made their return or debut. So let's talk about the first group, which are the characters that returned from Mortal Kombat 9, starting with Sonia, Johnny Cage, and Raiden. These were the only heroes that survived the events of Mk9, so it was important for them to return. Alongside them, you had Quan Chi and Shinnok. By the end of Mk9, it was very clear that Quan Chi would return, but he would also return alongside the classic villain Shinnok. Shinnok was first introduced in Mortal Kombat Mythologies, but he was made playable as a character in Mortal Kombat 4. Speaking of villains, you know, if you have Sonya Blade in the game, you also know that Kano is not far behind, so he too made his return to MKX. Now let's talk about the ninjas, right? So in any Mortal Kombat fighting game, you are guaranteed to have the mascots on the roster, the mascots being Scorpion and Sub-Zero. But the fates of the other ninjas, or the playability or their presence on the roster of the other ninjas, are not always known. And that's what made Mk9 so special, is that every ninja was playable on that roster. Well, returning to Mk9, we got Reptile and Ermac. And this is the game where Ermac took on more of a mystical presence. He took on, his phrase was, "We are many, you are but one." So he took on the presence of an entity as opposed to being one individual being. And Reptile took on a more reptilian-like form. This isn't the first time he's been this way. I mean, historically, we've seen Reptile take different forms, and I think they struck the right balance in MKX. Also returning from Mk9 as DLC, but this time as a base roster, was Kenshi. If you recall, he was DLC in Mk9, but they decided to make him a base character, one of the more popular 3D era characters. Also returning, Mileena, playing a much bigger role in this game's story mode than the previous. And the next few characters that return from Mk9 actually return to MKX, but as Revenant characters. And that would be Liu Kang, Kung Lao, Kitana, and Jax. And I did those characters as a group purposely because, again, they were all killed in Mk9, but instead of just keeping them off the roster, they returned, which is something I'm going to unpack later in this video. Next batch of characters that were playable in MKX were brand new characters. They added a total of 8 new characters. The first being Cassie Cage, daughter of Sonia and Johnny Cage. I'm still getting over the fact that they actually had a kid together. Jackie, who's the daughter of Jax. Takeda, son of Kenshi, who was raised and trained by Scorpion. Kangjin, the younger cousin of Kung Lao. And these 4 characters that I just mentioned, Cassie Cage, Jackie, Takeda, and Kangjin, I deem them the combat kids. They all have some sort of lineage tied to classic MK characters, and they were all actually grouped together in a special forces group led by Cassie Cage. Also new to this game, Devorah, a female member of the Khitan race, self-proclaimed queen of the Khitan race. We also got Ferritor, who is a symbiote pairing of a young female rider with a masked brute. Also new to this game, Kodokan, an Oshtek warrior, who eventually becomes the Emperor of Outworld after the fall of Mileena, as following the death of her father Shao Kahn. And the final new character we got in this game was Erron Black, who's an Outworld mercenary and Netherealm's take on what a Mortal Kombat gunslinger character would be. The last batch of characters I want to mention that we could play in MKX were the DLC characters that came in 2 combat packs. The first combat pack, each combat pack had 2 Mortal Kombat characters and 2 guest characters. The first combat pack gave us Tanya, who had an active role in the story mode, but was first playable in Mortal Kombat 4. Tremor, first introduced in Special Forces, Mortal Kombat Special Forces. And the guest characters for this pack were Jason Voorhees, a horror icon from the Friday the 13th movies, as well as Predator, an iconic movie character. Combat Pack 2 gave us Bo' Rai Cho, a returning 3D era character who also appeared in the story mode, and Triborg, who is basically one cyborg that contained all the variations of Mortal Kombat's cybernetic ninjas. For the guest characters, we got Alien, who's another iconic movie character, and Leatherface, another horror icon from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies. So Getting into the rating for this roster, if I had to give it a rating, I would give it a solid 8. And now I'm going to unpack the pros and the cons of the roster for Mortal Kombat X. The first pro, I think, are the new characters. They were refreshing and they did not feel like a copy and paste. For example, Cassie Cage. She could have easily been a replacement for her parents, Sonya Blade and Johnny Cage, but instead Netherealm opted to introduce her to the game and have her fight alongside her parents as opposed to just being a copy and paste. Now, if you recall, back in Mortal Kombat Deception, we were introduced to a new character, Kira, who was literally a fusion of Sonya and Kano. And I was afraid that Cassie Cage could have fallen into that character once they announced that she was the daughter of Sonya Blade and Johnny Cage. I was afraid that she would have been MKX's Kira.
Kira is a Black Dragon member. She's kind of with Kano and everything. And one of the cool things about Kira was that because she's kind of with Kano and she's against Sonya, well, the one thing that I wanted to do was I wanted to give her a combination of all of Kano's moves and Sonya's moves from Deadly Alliance. So she's kind of like the morph of Kano and Sonya. So she's a bad person, but she has all of Sonya's moves. She also has Kano's fighting style, and all of their super moves combined together we gave Kira.
The problem with that is the problem with the fusion characters can be displayed just by looking at what happened to Kira. Kira looked cool. She had cool fatalities, but because her special moves and her fighting strings were not unique to her, because we had seen those same exact moves attached to not only previous characters but classic characters, unfortunately it didn't allow Kira to have an authentic presence in the universe. And I was so happy that Cassie Cage did not take on appear in Mortal Kombat X that way. Instead, she forged her own path and she fought alongside her parents. And I was happy that they brought back Johnny Cage and Sonya because they definitely earned their spot. And it's the same what happened with Cassie is the same way that Jackie was introduced. Jackie herself, she could have easily just been a replacement for her father, Jax, but instead she fought alongside Jax and sort of had her own take on Jax's playstyle, which I thought was great. But if you ask me who were the best new characters, I think the top two would be Kotal Kahn and Takeda. And between Kotal Kahn and Takeda, I think the best new character in this game is Takeda. And I'm going to talk about it right now. So Kotal Kahn, he brings a welcome change to Outworld. Typically, we have seen Outworld being ruled by ruthless dictators or some sort of mystical being or something like that. But Kotal Kahn was just a warrior. He was just concerned about Outworld, just concerned about protecting his people and nothing else. He worked alongside the Earthrealm warriors and the combat kids, but he didn't trust Earthrealm to really protect and guard the amulet. So he was kind of like this game's anti-hero. And that is a refreshing take for what an Emperor of Outworld should be, who has traditionally just been someone who just wants to kill and conquer realms and just be a badass. Whereas Kotal Kahn, he had a mission and it was all about protecting Outworld, and I like that. And just by looking at his special moves, I love Netherealm's take of like what the sun god would be. I love the way he punched. I love the way he slammed and how he used his powers. I know he got a lot of flack for looking similar to Org from the Tekken franchise, but I'll give him a pass because he just felt like a warrior. He's just such a badass. I really do like Kotal Kahn as a new character. But I think Takeda, hands down, is the best new character introduced in MKX. Not only did I like his moves, but I also, alongside Cassie Cage, I think Netherealm could have easily just said, well, you know, he's the son of Kenshi. He's been trained by Scorpion. What will a telekinetic ninja look like? They didn't do that. They instead just had him look unique, had him have unique moves. In fact, he doesn't even use telekinesis inside of the game. He's really just a warrior with these whip-like weapons that he has. And I thought that was great. And again, he could easily been just like a mashup of those two characters, but he's definitely the gem that appeared in MKX. Then Just talking about the new characters, I love the generational quality that the game had. It was very clear that the classic characters, classic being Sonia, Jax, Johnny Cage, and Kung Lao to a certain extent, it was very clear that MKX wanted to establish the next generation of fighters. You know, Jackie fighting along her father, Jax. Takeda, Takeda being in the game with his father Kenshi, and them working on their relationship, right? You know, him resenting Kenshi for not really being there for him, and Kenshi trying to, like, you know, explain to him, I was trying to protect you. I love that familial battle happening in the game. And then even just seeing the family dynamics between Cassie Cage and her parents, who are divorced in this game, I thought was a great touch. It's a different way to see the family structure that was brand new to Mortal Kombat. Usually it's just about Outworld's family and things like that. But I think this felt like, it felt relatable. And I thought that was great. Let's talk about Kangjin. Kangjin was Netherealm's first gay character, first LGBT character in the game. And I loved the way that they did it. They didn't slap a pride flag on him. They didn't announce him being a gay character. They just sort of slipped it into the story mode and let every person who played the story mode figure it out. And for me, it flew over my head. It was a very, and this is going to be a spoiler. Sorry ahead of time if you haven't seen it, but there's a very powerful scene between Kangjin and Raiden. And Kangjin is just upset with himself. He doesn't like who he's become. He doesn't like who he is. And Raiden is trying to encourage him to go back to the Wuxi Academy and train alongside the warriors in the Wuxi Academy. And Kangjin is just saying, I can't do it. They won't like me. They won't accept me. And Raiden says, they care only about what is in your heart, not whom your heart desires. And when I played the game, that completely flew over my head. I had no idea that they were hinting at his sexuality. And that's how you introduce representation into the game. And I really like the way that they handled it. They could have announced it just to show that they're being inclusive. But instead, they just slipped it in there and they had it be part of the character struggle. And then when you look at the character as a whole, how he carried himself, always trying to be confident and always trying to be in charge, when in reality, he really had trouble accepting who he is. And I think we could all relate to who Kangjin was. And I thought I really liked the way that they handled that character. And finally, talking about the new characters, I am not a huge fan of Erron Black, but I will acknowledge his popularity. And I think NRS, what they did with their take on what a gunslinger character would be, it was really successful. Erron Black really took off in terms of popularity in Mortal Kombat X. And again, it's just a testament to these new characters being really well done. They didn't have to replace other characters. They were established correctly, and they have a fan base. The other thing I want to touch on is Shinnok in terms of the pros of this roster. Shinnok returning as the big bad villain that we've always known him to be. I think the way MKX handled him was really, really great. The game's mechanics, the variation system where the game allowed you to play the same character 3 different ways. It wasn't always successful for many of the characters on the roster, but for Shinnok, they were more than successful. If you recall, when Shinnok was playable in Mortal Kombat 4, he was essentially that game's Shang Tsung, where he was able to utilize the special moves of other characters. When they brought him to MKX, they still maintained that mimic quality, but I feel like they expanded the character in terms of what he was able to do with his moves and his abilities. So he still had his first variation, which was Imposter, which allowed him to steal a special move of his opponent. But then they had Bone Shaper, which allowed him to fight with a staff. You know, he had his staff in MK4 and he had his staff in MK Armageddon. Even though I don't usually reference Armageddon, but I think what they did with his staff in that game was cool, and they brought it back and added some depth to it. And finally, they gave him a necromancer variation. Though he looked silly as hell with those skeletal hands, I think it was cool that they finally added utility to the actual skeleton hands that he's able to summon. And that's been a trademark of the character, and to give him an entire variation for it in MKX was really good. So I love the way they handled Shinnok in this game. And then the final thing I want to touch on are the DLC characters. I mean, Tanya returning. You know, the first time we saw her was MK4, and she had this boomerang weapon. And then when we saw her in Deception, they introduced these new weapons where she kind of had, like, they're called Kobujitsus. And I was excited to see her return with the Kobujitsus. But on top of that, not only did they maintain her special moves, the Kobujitsu, and even some of her magic components with her projectile and her Pyromancer variation, but then they added a Naginata staff. It's called a Dragon Naginata staff. And at first I was confused. I was like, why does Tanya have a staff? But again, adding layers to a character on the roster is just the right way to do things, especially for a popular character like Tanya. And then, oh my god, Boraitro. I will forever fight for Boraitro. I'm always going to love him. He is one of my favorite characters. And the reason why I appreciated him returning in this game, because much like Shinnok, they sort of added depth to what the character was able to do. I think in Deadly Alliance and Deception, when he was first introduced, he had a joke quality to him. He was a fat character who belched and vomited and farted. And I think that in MKX, when they brought him back, they added a mature quality to it. You know, he had he was a drunken master. He used a drunken stance. He had fire breathing. He had his staff. I just really love Boraitro, and I think he's not one of the most popular characters from the 3D era, but I think he has a lot to offer, and I really wish they would bring him back again. I love what they did with him in MKX. And again, much like Tanya, having a presence in story mode and then being downloadable later, I think is a way to go. And then Triborg, again, not a huge fan of the ninjas in this game, but Triborg just made sense. Not only was he a cyborg that had variations for Cyrax, Sector, and Smoke, he had a fourth variation for Cyber Sub-Zero, which, if you recall, was introduced in Mk9. So having Triborg in this game just made sense. And what a way to get around having 4 separate characters. Just throw them all in one. I like the way they did that. And Tremor. Clearly, Netherealm saw the success in what they did with Scarlet. If you recall, Scarlet sort of started off as a rumor, and they made her a fully realized character in Mk9. That was her first time. And I think the next logical step to that is to bring back characters who maybe had a presence, a very, very small presence in the universe, but bring them to a game, fully flesh them out, and let them be playable. And that's exactly what they did with Tremor. Tremor is from Mortal Kombat Special Forces, which, if you're having a conversation about some of the worst Mortal Kombat games, I think Special Forces is always up there. I owned the game and I played it as a kid, and it wasn't that good. But to see Tremor rise from that game and be so cool looking, see his moves be so cool, see him fully realized, I hope Netherealm continues to do this for a lot of their characters. They have a lot of characters who maybe they were introduced and they vanished. We never heard from them again. I would love to see them bring those characters back and add layers to them, and finally have them be fully realized members of, you know, characters that you can choose on the roster and play as. I think that's the future. They need to continue doing that. They were successful with Scarlet. They were successful with Tremor. I can't wait to see what else they do. Now, unfortunately, that ends all the pros for the roster. So let's talk about the drawbacks or the cons. Keeping with the DLC theme, for me, I didn't like the fact that we got 8 DLC characters and half of them were guest characters. I understand that guest characters are a recently realized marketing tactic to have characters from different franchises appear in the fighting game. I I understand and respect it for what it is. It is a marketing thing, and it is an opportunity to promote other franchises. But for Mortal Kombat in particular, it stings a little bit more because I know these characters are being introduced at the expense of other characters that could be DLC characters, right? Where's Fujin? Where's Serena? Where's Li Mei? Why weren't those characters made DLC despite having such a heavy presence in the story mode? You know, why weren't they given the Tanya and Boraicho treatment? I mean, Fujin was literally a badass in that story. So, I mean, not to say those guest characters took the place of, you know, the Fujins and the Serenas, but if we're going to have DLC, the majority of them need to be MK lore based characters and not DLC. And again, missed opportunity to put Fujin, Serena, or Li Mei in the game. I mean, I remember there was just such a rallying for those characters to be DLC because we hadn't seen them in so long, and for them to just appear in the story mode, it really created excitement around them. Speaking of missed opportunity, I think it was a missed opportunity to not reintroduce some of the Revenant characters. For example, Smoke, who reintroduced himself as an Enra. Why not take that opportunity to bring him back and flesh him out as an Enra and not Smoke? The same with Sindel. After she was such a wicked character that killed so many of our heroes, why not bring her back as a Revenant and explore that arc now while we see her in the story mode? I didn't understand why they didn't do that. Let's talk about the Revenant characters. Why kill the Revenant character? Why kill the heroes if you were just going to bring them back as zombies? I didn't understand that. I mean, I just think it's a cop-out. Like, if you're not going to stick to keeping them off the roster and keeping them dead, then don't do it. I didn't like the fact that half the Revenants just returned as Revenants. I just personally, I mean, because I saw the killing of those characters as an opportunity to bring new characters in, which they did, but also bring back other characters from the lore. And I think by just bringing back the Revenant characters, they sort of missed that opportunity to do the latter, which would be bring back other Mortal Kombat characters. Speaking of other Mortal Kombat characters, where is Jade? Why is Jade not, why wasn't she in this game and instead just became a variation for Kitana? I didn't understand why they did that. You know, she was clearly a zombie in Mk9, and she didn't even appear as a Revenant in MKX. She was just inexplicably absent, and that made no sense to me. And then I want to talk about some of the characters that were least successful. Like I said, out of 8 of the characters that were introduced, I think 5 of them really, 6 of them really, well, let me not even give it. I think the majority of them were good. But I want to touch on Ferritor, who I don't think Ferritor was a successful character. It was obvious that Ferritor is literally an experiment character. Ed Boon said it himself, or I'm not sure if it was Ed Boon, but one of the developers said they wanted to figure out, experiment with having 2 characters in one. And essentially what that did is Ferritor is just 2 characters in one. No presence in the story mode, no significance to the franchise's history. It's just a new character, and that's it. So I don't think Ferritor was really successful. I think it was literally an experiment character, and I don't want to see Ferritor return for that very reason. And then I want to touch on Devorah. It's not that I'm against Devorah's design per se. I kind of just don't like her. I was thinking about it. I was just like, I think I'm just not a fan of Devorah. I'm not entirely opposed to her presence, but I think the amount of significance and presence and the role that they gave her in this story mode. I mean, she killed 2 classic characters. She was right hand to Kotal Khan, and then she betrayed him. I mean, they gave her so much responsibility. And for a new character, it was like, I just didn't like that. And that was all the cons for talking about the Mortal Kombat roster. So in closing, the roster, let me get my notes together here. In closing, the roster of MKX took the story in an unexpected direction. Given the deaths of a handful of heroes, I fully expected there to be a much stronger presence from the 3D era characters, not only because I want there to be, but because it just made sense as the next logical step. Mk9 covered the events from Mk1 to 3, therefore MKX should have touched on Mk4 and beyond. But instead, the studio decided to go in a different direction, instead opting to bring back the same popular characters, despite them dying, and then deciding to add new characters, which again added a new generational feel. My hope is going forward, NRS takes more risks with who they decide should be playable on the roster. While the new characters were a risk, they were mostly successful because they were introduced alongside most of the classic characters, and they were not introduced at the expense of the legacy characters. The same can't be said for the guest characters. I think the guest characters were absolutely added in place of lore characters that could have satisfied the fans at the time. I didn't like that. So tell me what you think about my take on MKX's roster below. Do you agree with what I had to say about the new characters? Did you agree with my assessment of the MKX roster? Do you like the new characters that were introduced in the game? What are your expectations for the next Mortal Kombat game? Let me know down below and we can continue this conversation. I also want to state as a disclaimer, I understand I'm making this video when Mortal Kombat 11 is out, but that is something I will cover in another video, so stay tuned for that. Again, thank you so much for coming to my channel and watching this video. I appreciate it. Please make sure you subscribe, like, share this video, and check me out on all other platforms. All the links will be in the description. Again, thank you so much for stopping by, and I'll see you later.